Welcome to the S.O.A.P video series from Oak Tree Community Church in South Bend, Indiana. We have spent quite a bit of time in the book of Ezekiel, and we have finally come to the end.
Always good coming to the end.
Because you get to start a new one soon.
Yeah. All right, so last week was cool. And last week and this week is 9 chapters. And the reason that is so cool is it's all high points.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So many times we left on, and then everybody's going to die.
Right.
And now it's everybody's going to live.
One of those, yeah.
Yeah. So last week we saw what the millennial temple is going to look like.
Yep.
At least the dimensions, from the dimension standpoint, and got a little bit of an idea of how things are going to work.
Yeah.
Not exact. And then we also saw God entering his house, or the temple.
Yeah.
In there, which is cool.
very, very cool. God's going to come back to Israel, come back to the temple, and things will be good again the way they're supposed to be.
Yep. And I think since this is the end, we always got to do a recap, right? End of year, you got to do a recap.
Right.
You always got to do a recap. But I was surprised, on day one, we learned more about angels, right? When we first started Ezekiel. And we learned a little bit about the Israelites that were actually in Babylon, and how they really weren't different. Maybe, they had to move to a new location. They were still evil. They were still did their sinful ways. And God said at some point, Ezekiel, you're going to have a tough life. But at some point, these heart of heart people are going to say, we had a real prophet among us, and we didn't even know it.
Yeah, they'll finally recognize, of course, after the fact, unfortunately. But
Yeah, so we saw Ezekiel being commissioned. He knew his road was going to be hard. We saw that hard road. And time after time after time after time after time, and literally that many times, we saw how hard-headed the people were in Jerusalem, in Babylon, how many chances God gave them. It was always about adultery. It was always about the sinful nature of people, and God realizing that they're not going to change. Not that he gave up, but he did then leave his house. Right, he left his temple.
Yeah,
that was kind of a depressing time when we went home.
Yeah, yeah.
Ezekiel had the job of trying to replicate what was happening in Babylon, or what was happening in Jerusalem in Babylon.
Yeah.
One guy.
Object lesson is a phrase that we used probably more in this book than any other one of these that we've done.
I agree. We finally read about the fall. By the time it happened, I was going to say it was almost anticlimactic, but it wasn't. And finally, we get to see the future.
Yeah.
And we get to see God re-entering his house, and the description of the temple too.
Yeah.
Which is awesome.
So for these last 5 chapters, we're still future.
Yep.
We're still in the millennium.
Yep.
And there's still quite a bit of detail that God wants to make sure that the Jews of Ezekiel's day and all of us still going forward, because this is all still future for us, right? So we're still seeing what will the millennium look like, what will the millennium temple look like, and even other things, right?
Yeah. And I'm going to cherry pick, right?
There's
just
too
from
much.
From last week too. But here's the cool thing that happened right off the bat. So we know that God comes into his temple, right? God came in by the east gate.
Yep.
Okay, big deal,
right?
God says the east gate will remain shut.
Yep. He comes in, closes it, and it's done.
You build a whole gate to be used one time. Now, I assume if God were going to leave, he would leave out of the east gate.
Right.
God's never going to leave.
Right.
So this gate is going to remain shut.
Yeah, very cool.
So little things like that, right?
Yeah, very
cool. The next set of verses actually criticizes Israel. The people of Israel, they abuse the temple grounds in the old temple, and what God represented. And God even says, I was sitting on the other side of the wall while I was listening to you sin. And I was like, that was another one that hit me hard. On there.
Well, they forgot. I mean, they got so used to, familiarity breeds contempt, right? So they got used to the fact that, God's in there. God's presence is there with us. And so they just forgot, basically. And he's like, I was there
I heard you playing your loud music. Certainly the priests were terrible. Not every priest, but the
Right.
priesthood as a whole was terrible. They didn't fulfill their responsibilities, and they even pointed people to idol worshiping.
Yeah.
And they were responsible for a lot of deaths too.
Yeah.
And we heard this over and over. And last week we saw there was repercussions, and that was for the Levites, where the Levites can minister on the temple grounds, but they can't serve as priests to God.
Yeah, yeah. So the reason, in the middle of all this, this is what's going to happen and all this good stuff, the reason for the recap of, why are we, rebuking the priests again? Because only a subset of the entire priesthood, one family, we mentioned Zadok last time, one family is going to be able to serve as priests in the millennium, right?
Right.
So even if others could have been priests, yeah, you have other jobs to do. You're not going to serve as priests in the millennial temple.
Right. So there's a long list of responsibilities that they have to follow. Includes what they can wear, how their hair must be cut, who they can marry.
Very similar to the Mosaic law. And some people actually get confused and say, the Mosaic law is coming back. It's not. There are going to be differences, but there will be a law code in the millennium that has to be followed by the priests and by the people.
Right. And here's the reason you need to read this and that you need to take your time reading it. Because here's a line in here. They have to change clothes when they're going to the outer court so they don't transmit holiness to the people with their garments.
Yeah.
So these priests that are going to be around God, somehow God's holiness gets transmitted to their clothes.
Yeah.
And when they leave God's presence and they go to the outer, away from God, they actually has to physically change their clothes.
Yeah. Yeah. So
I love that verse.
Yeah, we saw that with the previous temple, Solomon's temple, and everything as well, right? Where and even in the tabernacle before the temple was built, with Moses and the tabernacle and the early priesthood, they had to be very careful about what they wore, when they wore it, what they did, what they ate, the whole thing. Because once they were ceremonially clean or holy, what they touched was brought into that, right? Was ceremonially clean. So they had to be careful about what they touched and didn't touch, the whole thing. Right. And if you imagine if that was true when it was just God's presence in the back room.
Right.
Imagine when Messiah, Jesus himself, which they don't know it's Jesus yet, but God with us is standing right there. Imagine how much more, careful they have to be, right?
Yeah. This branch of the priests will also teach about the difference between holy and common, and how to distinguish between ceremonially unclean and clean, what you were talking about. So it's still going to be a thing. And then they're also going to act as judges and keep the law. And I assume that would be for the Israelites.
Yeah, which was always supposed to be the plan, right? There was not supposed to be...
They're basically doing their job.
Yeah, they were not supposed to be kings. They were not supposed to be judges. They were not supposed to be, all of these other things. The priests were supposed to be the arbiters of the law and all that. And so basically, all this stuff that they were supposed to do thousands of years ago will finally come to fruition and fulfillment in the millennium.
Right. So as we go on with the chapters, we see what the temple looks like. We see the grounds, and now we keep expanding outward. And God is allocating really incredible tracts of land to this temple and the temple grounds. The priests are going to be living near the temple. Like all the priests are going to be living near the temple. So back in, quote, the olden days, they lived in with the various tribes. Each tribe had to give land or houses to...
to the Levites. It was to the Levites because...
So not even the priests.
Right.
More than just the priests.
So the priests would live near Jerusalem or whatever. But I mentioned this last time, and so the topography of Israel is going to change. The topography of the whole world will change in the millennium. But Israel, where Jerusalem is now sort of elevated on a hill, there's going to be this huge plateau right? I mean, and it will be the functional center of the world, the capital, everything of the world will be right there. So yeah, we can
We'll
imagine
still go
why
up to Jerusalem.
it's definitely still go up to Jerusalem. And when you get up there, it's not just going to be a city; it's going to be the city with this temple and all this tribal land and the priests and these tracts of land and everything. It's going to be massive. It's almost, even with the detail, it's almost unimaginable exactly how it's going to function.
Right. So there's also a ruling prince,
Yeah.
which I assume is over all this, but under Jesus.
Yeah.
And there's a list of things that this ruling prince will be responsible for.
Yep.
And they talk about scales, and the scales must have a just balance. I kind of took that two ways. I took it as far as the judges and everything have to maintain their integrity, which you would expect.
Right.
But also, literally, there's going to be commerce there, and there are literally going to be scales and merchants in the old Jerusalem, the money changers, right? Cheated.
Yeah.
And the scale, there's just something as little as cheating is no longer going to be,
it's not going to be allowed. Yeah, Jesus is going to wipe all of that old stuff, all of the cheating and everything. The prince here mentioned very well could be David himself as king over Israel under Jesus again. There's a lot of stuff that we still don't know.
Right.
Even with and they Ezekiel didn't know at his point in history. And even with the stuff that we do know from the New Testament, there's still a lot questions that we don't know, right? So we have to be careful in how dogmatic we want to be. But we've mentioned David a couple of times. A couple of weeks ago, we mentioned David as a ruler. But there will be Jesus, there will be, I think, David, and then multiple levels of government, which is not unheard of. Again, we can go back to Moses, and Moses set up several levels all the way down to you're going to rule over 50 people. You'll help 50 people make decisions, and 100 people and 1,000 people before it gets up to Moses.
That was his father-in-law helping out, right?
Right. Yeah, and we see the same thing, multiple levels of governments with the priests and judges and princes. David will be there, and of course Jesus over the whole world.
Okay, we also know that this ruling prince will be making offerings and sacrifices on behalf of the people.
Right.
And there was burnt offering and grain offering and sin offering and sacrifices.
So the thing that we have to remember, again, people think, oh, it's the old Mosaic law coming back. It's not. But why? I mean, we can sort of understand why there will be animal sacrifice, or were animal sacrifices before Jesus died. The question that always comes up is, are these literal animal sacrifices in the kingdom, in the millennial kingdom, after Jesus died? And the answer is yes, for a couple of things. First of all, we have to remember, not every sacrifice was for sin. There are free will offerings, there are votive offerings, there are all sorts of reasons. They're called offerings for a reason, right? Not just sacrifices. So yeah, there will be chances where people can bring their offerings to God, and this will be the way to do it. Secondly, even in the Old Testament, the sin offerings didn't actually pay for sin. They just covered them, right? Sort of like fines. You broke the law, you paid a fine. Okay? Right. The same thing will be true in the kingdom, in the millennial kingdom. You break the law, you pay a fine. Okay? So it doesn't run into, well, Jesus paid for sin already. Yes, he did, right? But in the same way that Jesus has paid for our sin, and we still need to be made right with him, we confess our sin, we acknowledge our sin, and we come back into fellowship with God. We're going to see the same thing in here. It refers to an atonement, a covering for sin that makes you right with God. But a lot of these are also national. Some of these are individual, but there's also national. If someone sins unintentionally, and you've got your Passover, and you still have all of these things like the Old Testament. And again, Jesus hadn't died yet. When Ezekiel saw this, he had no frame of reference for when there wouldn't be sacrifices necessary for sin. And so we have to remember to read this from an Old Testament perspective before Jesus died, and then say, okay, how will this work? Ezekiel just assumes everything's normal. How will this work from our side after Jesus' death? What still should happen? What can't happen? And how can we understand this theologically, not just literally?
Yep.
So sorry, a lot of stuff in
that's fine.
there. That's
but God does include a lot of detail in some other things,
Yeah.
like the flow of people.
Yeah.
So he has, again, a line in here. If you come in from the south gate, you need to leave to the north gate.
Yeah, one
you know,
way.
meaning, straight line out, right? No
Yeah.
turning back around. So
Yeah.
the crowds are going to be big. It's, okay, this sounds terrible. It's like Disneyland, where they've thought out the rides, they thought out the direction that people are going to go, and how they're going to move from one thing to the next
Well,
thing.
I mean, imagine if it's not even just Israel, but what if the whole world has to come through here at different times? Then you'd have to do crowd control. And I love the fact that, I love the fact that God has already thought through crowd control.
Right. Maybe he thought about the other stuff too.
Maybe he thought about the other stuff too, and he just didn't fill us in. Yeah. But the fact that he mentioned that one means that, there is a much bigger plan.
Yeah. So there's a chapter, if not two chapters, on water. So water's going to flow from under the threshold of the temple to the east.
To the east, which is
we're actually going to flow two ways, right?
Yeah.
We're going to find out it's going to go into the Mediterranean Sea and into the what we call the Dead Sea.
The Dead Sea, yeah.
So Ezekiel was following this bronze guy, and this bronze guy is still measuring everything going around. So he's measuring the depth of the water too, and it starts out. When he went every 1,750 feet, it got significantly deeper.
Yeah, so say roughly a third of a mile, right? A third of a mile. And at first it was just up to his ankles, and then it goes up to his calves and his knees. And
and then you're not swimming in this.
Yeah, it's so much, so deep, so fast. And it's not just the depth, but it's also the current at this point. Because it's going, remember, if Jerusalem is way high on this plateau, it's going down to the Dead Sea. So it's not only picking up depth, it's picking up current. Right? And by the time it gets down to the end, the current is moving so fast, you don't want to get into it.
On both sides of this river are trees. And there's a lot of discussion about these trees. We see that this water helps things teem to life. When the water gets down to the Dead Sea is not going to be dead anymore. It's going to be teeming with life. Teeming with fish. Teeming with things. And go ahead.
Well, I just wanted, sorry to interrupt, but this, you might be thinking, man, I've heard this somewhere before, and I have not been in Ezekiel. Well, no, because this sounds exactly like the New Jerusalem in Revelation 22.
Right.
The difference, though, we've got to be very careful. In the New Jerusalem, in eternity, not in the millennium, but in eternity, the New Jerusalem specifically says there will be no temple. Right? Which means we have to be very careful, because here it doesn't say it's just coming out of the city, but it's coming out of the temple.
Right.
So
it's one way to know it's a difference, and we're not talking about
eternity, right? And the New Jerusalem. But some aspects of the millennial kingdom and the millennial temple and the millennial Jerusalem will be redone in eternity in the New Jerusalem.
Yeah, all these trees are good for food. The trees bear fruit each month.
Every month.
And it in Revelation, it specifically says a different fruit.
A different fruit every month.
Didn't say that here. I was like looking for it. Didn't say it.
Well, but the leaves are going to be for the healing.
Yeah, leaves for the healing.
Yeah.
Right. We still don't know the healing of the nations.
Well, in Revelation it says of the nations. Here it just says for healing. So again, we've got some differences. So much similarity. But
you want to read into it, but
we've got to be careful that we don't read Revelation back into Ezekiel. But we read Ezekiel into the Revelation, right?
Yeah, so at the end of this chapter, God tells the nation what their boundaries are for Israel.
Yeah.
And that would fulfill the Abrahamic covenant, finally.
Yeah, finally.
And it seemed like there was a tract of land that was going to go specifically for Abraham. And then also the Gentiles are going to be allocated some land too.
Yep.
And then when we finally get to the end, they're actually dividing it up.
Yep.
What tribe gets what land is already figured out.
Yep.
If you go back to in the time of Moses and Joshua, they sent out 2 men from each tribe, go figure it out.
Yeah.
Now God's saying,
I'm going to tell you
where
how much land you get. Well, and this is tribal land, again, in Jerusalem area, right? So we don't know how much even outside of this is, how much of the world, because the land promised to Abraham in Genesis 15 doesn't stop at the Jordan River like some of this does. It actually extends all the way to the Euphrates River. Right. So much of the Middle East, all the way down toward Egypt and up toward the north. And, here it mentions Damascus. So we're talking Syria. And there's a huge plot of land. So we don't want to think of Israel just in the little strip that it is now. It's going to grow much bigger. So I don't think that this even covers everything that is going to be. I think this is special tracks, but not all of the tracks.
Okay, that there'd be other.
I think there's other stuff too.
Nice.
Yeah.
Nice.
It's going to be big. I still think, like I said, I don't think we can fully comprehend or imagine exactly what even the millennium is going to be like, much less eternity.
Yeah, well, that's not a bad thing.
Yeah.
So that brings us to the end of Ezekiel.
Yeah.
And if I had to recap, definitely an action-packed book. Definitely went places that I really didn't think it was going to go.
Yeah.
He carried the story through of what's going to happen to Jerusalem and why. God leaving the temple, certainly very traumatic here. But there was all through it, we hear that God isn't doing this necessarily for the nation of Israel. God is doing it for himself.
Yeah.
To protect his reputation.
Yeah.
And all throughout we heard over and over again, then they will know that I am their God.
Yep.
And I think that's very fitting to put that at the end. And I finally Googled it. Google told me that 58 times that showed up.
58 times?
In Ezekiel.
Wow. Yeah. Yep. And that fits with the very last line of the book as well, because it's really not about Israel. It's really not about Jerusalem. It's really about God, right? And the very last line of the book is the name of the city from that day forward will be, in Hebrew, it is Yehovah Shammah. Jehovah is there, which ties in with Emmanuel, God with us, and the God's presence and everything. It's still all about God. Yeah, there will be people there, but that's not the point.
Yeah, right.
God will be there. Jehovah's there. So
yeah, it's a good book.
Very good book. If it's been a while since you've read Ezekiel, maybe this is the first time you've gone through it and you're just almost dumbfounded. It's like, whoa, how much we've learned. Like Gary recapped at the beginning here. I hope you've enjoyed the time that we've spent through here. And maybe this is on your list. You're like, there are parts of this I need to go back to.
Definitely. Yeah,
spend a little bit more time.
Right.
It's like, okay, that whole angel thing, that needs a little bit of extra work, right?
Yeah,
and some other stuff in there. And hopefully this just whets your appetite for more Bible study. That's what we do here at Oak Tree. More Bible study, end time study. And we always say this, make sure that you don't leave your questions unasked. Right? Send your questions in. We love to take those and just help you study what the Bible says more and more. So, like we say around here, you can know God better, you can love him more because of the information that he's given us. We'll come back next time with a new book. Until then, enjoy and send us your questions and we'll see you next time.
Bye.